And now, the bit that I have been nervous about all day. Clive Robertson, a titanic figure of Australian broadcasting and a person who I am forever honoured to say was my mate. Clive passed away this week, and all day it's sort of come and gone about the tears for a guy who would absolutely hate that he's been even spoken about, let alone spoken about in this sort of overly emotional way. You know who Clive Robertson is, I know who Clive Robertson is, but if you don't, here is how Patrick Burns celebrated the life of this incredible broadcaster on 7 News tonight.
It was a whole new world of news.
Good evening. There's a sense of déjà vu about this first story. Good evening. There's a sense of déjà vu about this first story.
Clive Robertson, a 1980s news ratings sensation.
I think it's time for another beat up, don't you?
A newsreader who wouldn't stick to the script.
Should have been a technician. Except I had better toiletry habits.
A train nut, a published photographer, friends say he was a recluse with a deep religious faith.
Trying to animate this show. I said, could you be a bit more animated?
Clive privately battled cancer for about a year. He would have been 79 in 2 weeks. A legend, gone from the news world.
Good night.
Patrick Burns, 7 News.
Like any little kid who dreams of being on the radio one day or maybe being on the telly, you are really aware of who's on the radio and who's on the telly. And we were really aware of Clive Robertson being on the television more so than the radio. Now, he'd been on the radio for a long time before at 2BL, which is now 702 ABC Sydney, as he would often refer to it as. And he was a phenomena. He was the type of person who could turn nothing into like an hour-long bit that he'd bring back 2 days later, and he worked on layers and levels that a lot of people it's impossible to even explain how he did what he did, but when you were experiencing them, you knew that somebody was playing some pretty cool music. But I watched him on television, and my beautiful friend Andrew watched him on television as well. And we grew up and we watched this late night show, and it was called News World, and it was on roughly about 10:30 on Channel 7, and it was Clive reading the news. And Clive had read the news before on the 11 a.m. program, but this was a newscast where he would read the news perfectly with that beautiful, incredible voice, but he'd start mucking around because that's Clive. He can't not muck around. He can't not poke fun. And then that became the attraction. So you were able to watch, and it's all on YouTube, and you can sit around and have a look back at long versions of the show, and there's all stuff about the Berlin Wall falling and nuclear arms race, and then there'll be a silly story about dolphins, all of those sorts of things. But this wickedly funny, smart man who, the more you watched him, the more you loved him, and the more he became a friend in this sort of very, before it was clever to say something was cult-like, there was just this way of saying, did you see it, did you see it? And there was a certain group of people who saw it and got it, and there were other people who didn't, and they were missing out. And my dear friend Andrew, I say, because, of course, back in the sort of 80s and 90s, when people did things on television, the kind of highest compliment that could be paid of them was when somebody would take the piss out of them on like a comedy company or a fast forward show. And when we were in year 6 at school, we all sort of did these little skits about a fake TV show. And I was doing the Steve Vizard thing, and Andrew did Clive Robertson. He was very good at it. A few years later, I ended up working at Radio 2SM with my dear friend Jason Morrison. And Jason had brought me over there after starting my career journalistically at 2GB, and that's where I started to meet Clive, and Clive was doing the breakfast show then. And I, as I have said many a time, is a high-functioning dyslexic, which means when you come up against a person as brilliant as Clive and you put words in the wrong place, he points them out. And then there'd be a little test about whether you could take it. And clearly he liked that I could. And then we became friends. And anyone who knows Clive, and without betraying the privacy of Clive, is that there's not a lot of people in his world at any one time. And I was lucky enough to be one of the very few people in his life for a nice chunk of time. And in that time, I had a guy who I loved watching as a kid slowly poke fun at the world, help me build a worldview, help me work out how I would like to do what I'd like to do. And there's a lot of things that happen on this show that are even unconsciously things that we've talked about over the years. And tonight, a little later in the show, Jason is going to be here because he was Clive's forever friend and his beautiful wife, Heidi. And they were both by his bedside as he passed. And Kel Richards, who of course you know here at Sky News, he worked with him at the ABC and has an equally wonderful turn of phrase. And I'll save a little more for a little later, but if we could take a wide shot of this desk, guys, because you may notice something that's different about this show than lots of other shows on the telly, and certainly lots of the other shows here at Sky News, is these microphones. I don't use a lapel microphone, we have these microphones. And these microphones are Neumann microphones, which are really fancy ones from Germany. And they pick up a beautiful sound. And they're the ones that Clive used on his show. So for me to be sitting here tonight talking into a Neumann microphone on a television about a man who was awesome is equally thrilling and tough. And I can also hear him say, "Okay, enough, Murray, that's it." So that's it for now, but we'll talk about more later. But Clive Robertson rocked. And one of the things whenever you do a job like this that you're most afraid of when you don't do a job like this is that one day you'll just be forgotten. It is my mission tonight to make sure that he is not forgotten and that we celebrate Clive Robertson a little later tonight on Paul Murray Live.